thank you so much for all your questions. I hope that we can keep a few more.
Yeah, the idea, well, it's a very good sign that we went a little bit ahead of our time, so we don't have a lot of time. And first of all, I would really like to thank all our speakers and participants for this wonderful and wonderfully long session that we've been sharing here. And it's quite remarkable how, there's another seat here, Lucia.
No, I'm fine.
Okay.
Okay.
It's quite remarkable how there seems to be this mushroom, not umbrellas, Lucia was mentioning, that aesthetic paradigms seem to be allowing for forms of collective intelligence and for us to come close. And I was quite impressed by the fact that more than thinking on how can we learn from animals or how can animals teach us about something, we've actually been from different perspectives, but imagining ways in which we can get closer, you know? And in which we can understand one another and be in a more intense form of proximity. And I think that's somehow something that united these very different approaches and presentations, and I think that's quite remarkable. And I don't know if we should, do you think we have time to ask something? Should we open that?
Should we start with your questions? I just wanted to say one thing. Ben Vickers, who co-curated the exhibition of Ian Cheng that we spoke about at the beginning, together with Rebecca Lewin, who is here, is not able to join us tonight. But if you do have questions about Ian's show specifically, and particularly the context of artificial intelligence, then you can shout them out, and maybe Rebecca will give us some answers. But we're happy to hear from you, I think.
Okay, if you were to give us one challenge to take away as a thought this evening from what we've heard, what would it be? That's a big question, I know. So you have to think about it. But you know, what would it be? What do you want us to learn from this evening that we take away so we come back in part 2 with bigger and better questions?
I can tell you what part 2 is going to be about, because there will be a part 2. No, I'm kidding. But part 2 happens to be about interior multitudes and symbiosis and modes of thinking that sort of unblock this kind of, or try and break open this kind of notion that we are singular and separate from everything, and sort of think about how, if we're multitudinous from our gut bacteria all the way to our relationships, to our pregnancies, then how can we think about the self in a different, or how can we not think about the self in quite the same way? But yes, what is the
I would
challenge?
just add maybe that all of us interact with non-humans in our lives, and maybe there are ways to think about how you interact with birds and cats and dogs and any other non-humans that you come across. And I mean, one of the things I did once was just trying to whistle and mimic the bird song that I was hearing. And there were definitely birds that were responding. That's something to try. I sort of kneeled in a field of cows and for a long time, because I do think time and space is really important in terms of opening up, yeah, as you said, yourself and the communication, and for non-humans to feel they can trust you, because mainly, you know, we eat, turn non-humans into shoes and bags, and there's quite a, in fact, very interesting when you go to the Galapagos, where they're not going to be hunted. The relationship that the non-humans have with the humans is very different from one in which they're under threat. That's something else to think about.
Well, thank you, Peter, for
Yeah.
saying that. Yes.
Thank you, Peter, for saying that. My question that I had all evening almost, like after hearing a few of the speakers, is that you're talking about interacting with animals and understanding animals, and you're talking about animals being voluntary in the process, but is it even possible to have research about animals approaching us? And I think there was a story in one of the videos in one of the movies where, or I don't recall who it was, but that alien life forms might actually not want to be detected and that thus keep quiet. So is there any research about animals trying to interact with humans? Is there any reason to believe that they don't want to interact with us in the first place?
Yeah, I'd love to answer that for a second. So I'll give you an example. So it's dangerous if you let your presence be known if you don't know who's out there in some cases. Sometimes it's better to wait a little bit and find out. I'll give you an example. We moved 2 elephants in with 2 other elephants at the zoo in the Bronx Zoo many years ago. I've worked in the zoological community for a long time. And we recorded, and it was really interesting to see these elephants that were in a facility hearing a truck come up, sniffing with their trunk like crazy, their ears splayed out, listening, sniffing, and then as soon as the elephants got close enough where they seemed to detect it, there was all this communication back and forth. And you know, when I was involved with SETI a bit, I remember being at a conference and we were talking about the fact that, you know, we're not supposed to be sending signals out. It's a security issue. We did at one point, and now they're not supposed to. And of course, you know, with the Fermi paradox, the question is if everybody's doing the same thing, everybody's listening, nobody's sending. But it's something to think about, I think.
When you talk about choice and animals being able to switch off, do you ever think about the fact that maybe they can't and they'll be as addicted as we are, and that we don't turn off, we might want to, and the fact that you can not engage with technology doesn't mean that you won't? Does it worry you? It worries me as a human.
I think an off switch is really important, and I think that watching animals with technology, I think we have to be responsible to some extent. It's a challenge. How much do you put out there, and what kinds of things do we do? And I don't have an answer for that, but we're trying to extend it. So.
But I presume that if you saw that dolphins were engaging in what seemed like compulsive or addictive app playing,
yeah,
you might
reduce their viewing
yes.
time. Yeah, I think we probably would. This is such an open-ended issue. We don't even know if they would show this, but it's something to see. We didn't expect the response on the video as quickly, but they got bored after 2 sessions. Maybe that's. But
I'm sure, you know, I was a big fan of the John Lilly books too, and I'm sure Diana can tell you, you know, that they have very different sexual mores than we do. Now, so, you know, should we impose our sense of morality on any other species? That's a question that's going to come up. And I think these are all good points, and I'm sure, like anything that can be addictive, it could, you know, be used positively or negatively.
Can I just bring this down to earth for 1 second real quickly? So if you have a mouse, do you know that you can actually ask the mouse what kind of bedding material they'd like to use? And very few places do that have mice in labs. I mean, you know, I'm just thinking about a mouse. If you give a mouse a choice, it's like if you give a mouse a cookie, but if you give a mouse a choice, they'll generally go for a bag of substrate that they prefer. So we can ask animals quite simply what they prefer. Give them choices. They will tell you in many cases.
Before opening, we would like to just ask a question also to the artists and writers in this table, and it relates to the fact that we're here gravitating around sorts of issues that Allora Calzadilla's video tackles really well, which is forms of rendering and forms of recognition and forms of empathic relation that allows us humans to comprehend or to imagine or to project. And I would just like to ask those of you who want to answer, how do you address anthropomorphism in your work, in the sense, because ultimately we need to translate. We feel the need to translate. We feel the need to render into something that we recognize, that we acknowledge, that we know. And for instance, Rasmus, when you were talking about the project that you were going to develop in the South Pacific, which is exactly imagining how to establish a relationship with a context that has barely any relationship with humans. How can you do that, departing from your human self, but without engaging in a very obvious form of anthropomorphism or of using a language that you know? Of course, once more, it's not as big as what is the message that we can take home, but it's still a big question.
I think what Ted's text was teaching us, the one we saw, I can't remember the name of the
Great Silence.
The Great Silence, is a very powerful human ability to sort of think from a different perspective, and maybe also answering the gentleman over there's question about what to take home. I think this is an important element, that we can actually do this. I might not have done a good impersonation of a clam, but I think we can actually jump sort of species with our imagination. And maybe the animals just are going to think that we are incredibly silly. But that's okay, because I think we can actually learn something from it. So I think we do not know what the animals will think about this. And we might be making the mistake of anthropomorphizing everything. It's hard not to. But I think while we are doing these experiments, also the one that Peter was showing us, I think we're also not just talking to the monkeys, we are sort of talking to ourselves as well. Yeah. And as much as we're talking to them. As in text, in the text that you wrote, Ted, also, where we are like parrots suddenly. And there's a, I don't know, there's a kind of liberating element in this, because we've also been haunted by this sort of 2,000 years of monotheistic torture by a couple of big Middle Eastern ideas, which sort of puts us in a very specific category of things that are alive, created in the image of God or whatever it says, and sort of separate from everything else. And there is this kind of, I think, acknowledgement now coming from so many different areas, art or science or literature. I mean, that things are kind of bubbling out there. The trees are talking, the ducks are talking, and we don't really know what they're talking about, but we sort of sense it intuitively. And that is not just sort of a new age 1970s hippie perspective. There's some hard science backing it up. Thank God. So, and I don't know. I think that's it's very moving. I find sort of very basic joy in that idea that a plant can talk. There's a very moving story, actually. Can I just say something really quickly? With this Australian-Italian marine biologist who used to study fish and fish behavior. And as scientists who study that sort of things, they often have to sort of cut up the fish to see what's inside and how things are doing that, you know, with the intestines and so forth. And she was a vegetarian and had a hard time doing that, because in her studies she was sort of figuring out that, God, these fish have personalities. I mean, maybe she was anthropomorphizing them, I don't know. Maybe she was just feeling bad because she was realizing another kind of intelligence. So then she went to study plants instead. And then the same thing happened. I mean, she sort of realized, oh shit, this, you know, they're alive, which is obvious. And I guess like other cultures, this is maybe also a very Western sort of thing, that other cultures have known this, and we tend to have maybe just forgotten it. And now is a kind of time of sort of, you know, putting out our ears in all kinds of ways. And it might be silly from time to time, but I think we sort of, we have a moral obligation to do it, actually.
I have a
Can we keep going there?
Okay, just a minute. I'll just say that with regard to the question of anthropomorphic projection, I think that in general, I don't think we're at great risk of overdoing it on the anthropomorphic projection because, historically we have, I think erred much too far in the other direction, and from a variety of different orientations, the religious one being, a long-standing one of humans being different from everything else. But even in the 20th century, like Skinner's view that animals were basically simple, little more than automatons that responded, to stimuli, and I think that idea of animals is so powerfully ingrained in us that I think that as a culture we're not going to be able to move too far in the other direction anytime soon. I think that in general, engaging in some anthropomorphic projection will only work as a slight counterbalance, and will slightly push the needle. I think it would be very difficult and take a long time before the needle ever got to the point of being too far in the other direction.
Question for Michela.
Yeah, I was wondering, the bird and your Skype interactions with the bird. One, how did you choose what to interact with, how to interact with the bird? And did you feel like the bird reacted to the different kinds of interactions in different ways? And did you ever meet the bird in person?
No, actually, I never met a Celoder in person, so I don't know if I want to meet her. I'm not decided on this, but I started, to think about language, so I started to try different kind of things. And in the first video, for example, for me it was like the first period that you have when you learn a new language, which is adapting, and it's very like physical. You try to do exactly the same things that the other person do. So I was trying to think in which way there could be similarity between these two spaces. And a Celoder reacted, my private conversation with a Celoder, that I do a lot of things, different things, audio, images, and I feel that, for example, at the beginning, I thought that she would have reacted more with sounds, but actually she is very reactive with images, with colors. So I tried a lot of different things. Mostly I read her poems, or or I make her listening some poems of other people, or I make her listening her own sounds that I recorded, and I observe her a lot.
I have a question. Hello.
We have two questions down this side before.
A quick question, which is kind of an observation. Obviously, a banal one. We're in a zoo, and it seems as though almost all of the participants, the animals were in a condition which was completely controlled by humans, and then they were trying to, in some way, give control, etc., or language, or interact. Would anyone like to respond to that? Because it seems to me that there wasn't an opportunity really to talk about it from the other side, from an animal that was not somehow confined, constrained, caged, or conditioned by us. So it seems a little bit like a prisoner who, for good behavior or through some kind of rehabilitation, could achieve certain things.
Yeah, I'd love to answer that. So I think that, as Ted was saying, that we've been used to hearing that animals are mindless, that they're automata, automata. And, you know, it's finding that balance. I'm going to get to answering this in a second, but we have to find that balance between not being overly anthropomorphic or overly anthropocentric. Okay, and we used to, for a long time as scientists, I'm speaking as a scientist because I can't speak for anyone else, we've had to be extremely careful in not over-interpreting, okay? At the same time, giving not saying, no, they can't do it. To say no, an animal can't do something is an unscientific response. We can say, we don't know if they can do this, you have to ask. And to do studies, it's very difficult. As much as many of us would like to do studies with animals in the wild, you can do all sorts of studies with wild animals, looking at their social behavior, looking at all sorts of things they do. It's very hard to collect data that you can on cognition and do it in the wild. Several of us have tried, and it would be wonderful, and it's sort of a dream to do that. But for now, we're trying to give animals that may have some constraint in their life as being in captivity a way to have more freedom and to have other means of communication. And I think that we hope that we're going to enrich their lives while we're enriching our science. But it's really important to do controlled experiments, because if you can't, I mean, it can be controlled in the sense that they have lots of freedom, but you're able to replicate, you're able to watch over time. So you're doing systematic observations, because anecdotes just don't fly in terms of science. And if we're trying to learn about animal minds, we do have to still have those replicated experiments. And that's where we are right now. Maybe it'll change in the future.
You know, I don't know. I think zoos are in a period of transition, and obviously we're only about 100 years away from when we used to grab people from where they lived and have them in cages or in circuses for our entertainment. And society changes, and I think you're seeing it changing with circuses. It's going to happen with zoos too. And I think the zoo of the future, I mean, you should respond perhaps, but I'm sure will look very, very different to what we have now. And, you know, we've often talked about, you know, where you let the inmates in charge of the asylum, and perhaps the visitors become the caged part of the zoo. And, for example, you get a dozen shower heads, and the visitors have to stand under the shower head for a certain length of time, and one of the non-humans then gets to choose who gets wet. You know, there are a lot of things that, but I mean, should they morally, you know, do we have the right to capture and keep them in cages? I would clearly say no, but is it necessary in the short term? Are they evolving in a way that encourages conservation? I think zoos are definitely going down that path, and in the way that seed banks are vital for the plant world, I think zoos do have a role in the animal world, but I'm sure we're going to see a lot more sort of compassionate and understanding of non-human intelligence in what the zoo of the future, if it exists at all, looks like.
I just want to jump in because I've spent most of my academic career working in zoological situations, like at the Wildlife Conservation Society and others. And, you know, zoos have evolved like other institutions, as Peter's saying. And most zoos, there are some good zoos, there's some bad zoos, but a lot of the zoos, including this zoo, they spend so much time and effort into both conservation and welfare, and often people don't understand it. And again, there are changes that are going on that people aren't aware of, and I think that the more we learn about these animals, some animals can fare very well in a zoological context and some can't. And I think part of it is seeing which ones seem to thrive and which ones don't, because if we don't have them, and this, I'm not saying zoos are good or bad, I'm just saying it's something for discussion. If it's out of sight, often animals are out of mind. And I think we have to keep public awareness up about these animals. And often zoos where they can impact millions and millions of people, they're the people who are educating the most. Again, we have to have zoos that are appropriate. And there's some great ones and there's some really terrible ones. So.
I hate myself for having to do this. Forgive me, please, as much as I will never forgive myself. We have to wrap it up because we don't want to overstay our welcome, and we do have we have to leave this building quite soon. And I want to make sure that we get a chance to see Michela's last film, which she produced specifically for this event. And trust me, after 3 hours of sort of intense brain work, this video is exactly what you need, no? And So stick around for that. It's an 8-minute piece for which we're incredibly grateful. But first of all, please join us in being unbelievably forever grateful to our participants, Rasmus, Peter, Diana, Ted.